Hi, this is Sarah Butcher with the Side Comment. On today's episode, Matthew L. Harris joins us to discuss the history of the Church of Latter-day Saints' complicated and often controversial racial heritage. From Joseph Smith and Brigham Young through the Civil Rights Movement to the moment in 1978 when church president Spencer W. Kimball finally opened the priesthood. Matthew Harris is professor of history at Colorado State University Pueblo. He specializes in race and religion, civil rights, Mormon history, African American history, and American religious history. His latest book, Second Class Saints, published by Oxford University Press, takes a deep look at the history of Black Mormons and the struggle for racial equality within the church.
Hi, my name is Matt Harris, and I am a professor of history at Colorado State University Pueblo, where I've taught since 2005. And today I'm here to talk to you about my recently published book called Second Class Saints, Black Mormons and the Struggle for Racial Equality. This is a topic that I've lived with for a number of years. And what I want to do today in the limited time that we have is to tell you some of the main themes that may interest you as you teach American religious history and civil rights and race. Well, the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, or Mormons as they're affectionately called, they had this priesthood and temple ban that began in 1852 under the church's prophet president Brigham Young, and it remained in place for 126 years until 1978. Another prophet president named Spencer W. Kimball lifted it. And the founding prophet Joseph Smith, when he founded Mormonism in 1830, Black men were allowed to be ordained to the priesthood. This is the priesthood authority to administer the church, to count tithes, to give pastoral care. So the priesthood is important in the Mormon church, and Black people, at least a handful of Black men, were ordained to the priesthood under Joseph Smith's tutelage. And his successor, Brigham Young, when he became the church's prophet president, when Joseph Smith died in 1844, he too allowed Black priesthood ordination, but that came to an abrupt stop in the early 1850s when some Black priesthood holders were taking white polygamous wives. Mormons believed in polygamy, or plural marriage as they call it, and it was a practice that was reserved largely for white people. And I say largely because some indigenous folks practiced polygamy as well, but it was mostly white people. And when Brigham Young learned that these Black priesthood holders were taking polygamous white wives, he announced a priesthood and temple ban in 1852 to the Utah Territorial Legislature. And so that ban, as I noted, had been in place for 126 years. And over the years, Mormons leaders had applied several different doctrinal rationales for the ban. One was something that they had inherited from the Protestant Atlantic world, also Catholics, and that is that Black people were the inheritors of a biblical curse. They called it the curse of Cain or the curse of Ham. But Mormons did something unique. After the American Civil War, they created an extra layer, if you will, of theological complexity, as I call it, which is that Mormons also tied the priesthood and temple ban to a pre-mortal existence, an ethereal life where everyone lived before they got bodies and came to earth. Well, in this pre-mortal existence, there was two plans as Mormon theology holds. One was Jehovah, or Jesus's plan, that is, he's creating this plan to give to his Father, that all of the souls will come back and live with God again righteously. And then there was Satan's plan that opposed Jehovah's plan. Well, Mormon theology holds that Black people couldn't decide if they were followers of Jesus's plan or Satan's plan. They were astride the fence. They were fence sitters. They were neutral. That was one Mormon thought. The other Mormon thought was they were less valiant. They were not valiant in their support for Jesus's plan. They were lukewarm, the theology goals. So you have these two contending theologies in the early 20th century that tie the priesthood and temple ban back to the pre-existent life. And those two theologies will have a staying power well into the 21st century in Mormon culture. The other thing that I want to talk about for a moment is the church, how they identified Black people. They used a racial marker, the one drop rule. And that simply meant that if you had 100 ancestors in your family tree and one was thought to derive from sub-Saharan Africa, you would be considered cursed. And it wasn't based on skin color, it was based on lineage. So you could have a person, blonde hair, blue eyes, and somewhere in his family line, his ancestor derived from Africa, he would bear the curse, as they put it. You could be from Fiji, and Mormons didn't think that dark-skinned Fijians derived from Africa. So they could hold the priesthood, even though they had dark skin, whereas people, even with white or light skin, had African ancestry. They were considered cursed because they had one drop of African blood. So these are racial markers that the United States Census followed in 1930 when they defined who a Black person was. And Mormons will pick up on this as well. And it becomes a tremendous challenge to bring Mormonism into the world. That is, they're trying to globalize after the Second World War, and they choose a couple of areas that are fraught with challenges when it comes to racial boundaries. One is in South Africa, and the other one's in Brazil. And in both of those heavily biracial countries, they target areas where they think are predominantly white. And it becomes a huge issue because a lot of these South Africans who are light-skinned, and also Brazil, who are light-skinned, when rumors circulate that they have African ancestry, they just simply pack their bags up, move to Utah, where they pass below the color line. So they have the one drop, or the curse, as they Mormons put it, but yet they look white in Utah, so nobody questions them. And they were able to experience upward mobility and advancement in the church, much as light-skinned Americans would do in the 20th century when they passed as white so that they could inherit the privileges of racial equality, going to the schools of their choice, the restaurants of their choice, and so forth. So Mormon leaders, they recognize that the one drop rule is fraught with challenges because word gets back to them that Latter-day Saints from South Africa and Brazil are leaving and going to Utah and Idaho. These are two predominantly Mormon communities. Also, there's a challenge with Mormon theology, and that is that the theology teaches that the Mormons are supposed to spread the gospel to every kindred, nation, tongue, and people, but they can't do it in sub-Saharan Africa. And so in these majority Black countries, they struggle to reconcile this prophetic or scriptural mandate to spread the gospel, but also with this doctrine that they've inherited from Brigham Young, that Black people are restricted from the temple and the priesthood. And so in the early 60s, Mormons try this unique experiment when Nigerians write the church headquarters in Salt Lake City, and they request to have missionaries come and open up Mormon churches. So they had read some Mormon literature in Nigeria. They requested missionaries to come and proselytize to them. And the church had put them off for a long time because they knew that Nigeria probably wasn't a good place for Mormon doctrine, given its racial teachings. But they experimented in the early 60s by sending in white missionaries from Salt Lake. And they're worried about the racial overtones, that Nigerians want to run their own churches and they don't understand this ban. And so they experiment with white missionaries, and it's a complete disaster. And one of the reasons why it's a disaster is because a Mormon named George Romney, Mitt Romney's father, recent presidential candidate, George Romney was one of the most prominent American Mormon politicians in the 60s. He was a presidential candidate in 64, at least they talked about him running for the office in 64, also in 68. And so the NAACP, when they got word that Romney was a Mormon and what his church was doing in Nigeria by having all white missionaries run all Black churches, the NAACP made a big fuss. And they wrote letters to the Nigerian government and other places in sub-Saharan Africa. And they said, you got to keep the Mormons out. They're racist. And the NAACP's letter, this is from the headquarters, they shut the missionary program down. The second thing I want to talk about, or a couple last things in closing, one is civil rights. Mormons were averse to civil rights, and they didn't believe in racial equality. They argued that if you broke down racial barriers in communities, including neighborhoods, in the workforce, it could possibly lead to interracial marriage. Interracial marriage terrified Mormon leaders because of this one drop rule. They favored, the offspring that such unions would create. Finally, after many, many different Protestant and Catholic religions start to reinterpret their theology in the wake of the civil rights movement, the Mormons will be compelled to lift the longstanding priesthood and temple ban in 1978. It took a consensus of all the leaders in the church. So in 1978, as I mentioned, Spencer W. Kimball, the current church president, lifted the 126-year-old ban that Brigham Young put in place in 1852. And Mormons believe in something called divine revelation. And revelation in the Mormon canon is a process, not an event. And what that means is that Spencer Kimball had to get buy-in from his counselors in the first presidency. So there's the church president, his two counselors. That constitutes the highest governing body of the LDS church, the first presidency. And he also had to get buy-in from the Quorum of the 12 Apostles, the second highest governing body of the church. And over the course of Spencer Kimball's church presidency, he knew that the church couldn't flourish and couldn't globalize unless this ban was lifted. And so he worked diligently for several months, and in fact, several years, to get his colleagues in church leadership to lift the ban. One little fun story is one of the apostles he couldn't win over, so he sent him to Ecuador on a church assignment while they lifted the ban in June of 1978. So call it, sneaky, devious, or brilliant leadership. That's for listeners to decide. So the ban was lifted in 1978. It allowed the church to globalize and to move into majority Black countries, including South America, including Sub-Saharan Africa, including the Caribbean. One of the things they didn't do when they lifted it in 1978 is they didn't repudiate the doctrine that had sustained the ban. They never said anything about the curse of Cain or the pre-existent theories that we've been discussing. And so Mormon racism continued to circulate in LDS meeting houses well into the 21st century. And it reached a crescendo in 2013 when the church had repudiated all of these teachings one by one in a document that they had produced and published on their webpage. And what led up to that document being published and repudiated was a Brigham Young University religion teacher named Randy Bott. He gave an interview with a Washington Post reporter in 2012 during Mitt Romney's presidential campaign. And Bott had articulated all of these anti-Black theologies to the Washington Post reporter. And of course, the Post reporter recognized there was a story here, published it, and the church was embarrassed. And the religion teacher didn't go rogue. You don't go rogue at the LDS Church's university and expect to keep your job. He didn't go rogue. The teachings had never been repudiated. So he thought that he was still in complete alignment with the church's theology, but he wasn't. The winds were shifting. And so after that interview was published, which embarrassed the church, they issued 2 public relations statements, even calling the professor out by name, which is extraordinary. They released this 2013 document the following year called Race and Priesthood. And to this day, it's the most authoritative document of the church repudiating their racial teachings. And I've had my students read it in class. It talks about that interracial marriage is not a sin. It talks about that God doesn't have favored lineages, so it rejects this idea of a racial hierarchy. It says that the church no longer teaches the curse of Cain or the pre-existent theories. And it's a wonderful document, but it doesn't offer an apology. So careful readers of the document will note that there is no apology. And the reason why the church leaders did not apologize is because that it could weaken their prophetic authority if they apologize for a doctrine that they no longer adhere to. And of course, the doctrine or the theology that they're most worried about today is LGBTQ. LGBTQ Mormons don't. They can't marry. They don't enjoy all of the privileges of other couples in the church. And so that's what they're worried about. That's why they haven't apologized. Instead, they've given lots of money to the Black community. The church has opened up its coffers and given millions of dollars to the NAACP. They've given money to Morehouse College. Last year, in fact, the NAACP awarded the current church prophet president, a man named Russell Nelson. The NAACP awarded him the highest distinction they have to offer because of his outreach to the Black community and his embrace of racial justice measures. So I want to iterate something that's important. and that is the Mormon racial story is the larger American story. You see Mormons digging their heels in with segregation and civil rights and teaching anti-Black theologies. And it just as it took the larger country time to overcome, and indeed still trying to overcome these things, so it is with Mormons. And so the Mormon story is uniquely an American story.